Hi, Assalamualaikum everyone. So today we will be presenting you the lab 6 given which titled Spinal Reflexes and Reaction in Human. So next, let me explain to you the objective of this experiment. Firstly, the experiment is to distinguish between spinal reflex and cerebral reflex. Secondly, is to investigate the speed at which the impulses are transmitted in the nervous system. And last but not least, is to determine the length of the nerve pathway between the point that receives stimulus and body part that respond. So moving on to the introduction, a reflex is an involuntary and predictable response to the stimulus. These discrete neural pathways which connect through the central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord, are involved in the performance of a reflex act, such as nervous pathway are called reflex arc. Most reflexes involve the brain but some only use the spinal cord. It is a negative feedback circuit that is comprised of the three main components, which are afferent neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. An organism's reaction time is the interval between the moment of the stimulus is applied and the moment the response commences. Measuring reaction times can give us some indication of the speed at which impulses are transmitted in the nervous system.
So this is our first experiment, experiment 6.1, swallowing reflex. The only material required in this experiment was a glass of water. The procedure here you can see, the first step is to swallow the saliva in mouth, and immediately afterwards we need to swallow the saliva again. Next, drink a glass of water and repeat the first procedure.
The next experiment is reaction time to sight. Material required for this experiment is 2 stopwatches. In this experiment, both experimenter and subject should start their stopwatch at the same time. Then, when the subject see the experimenter stop her stopwatch, the subject should stop her stopwatch too. The time lapse between the experimenter and the subject to stop their stopwatch are measured and recorded at the table.
For the last experiment, which is experiment 6.3, reaction time to touch, the material required is 2 stopwatch, a ruler, and a thread. The procedure for the last experiment is both the experimenter and subject start the stopwatch simultaneously and the subject must close her eyes. Second, the experimenter presses her stopwatch to stop and at the same time press on the subject's foot. Third, the subject press on her stopwatch to stop. Fourth, repeat 10 times, calculate and record the average reaction time. Fifth, measure accurately the length of the nerve pathway between the point where the stimulus is received and the part of the body using tract, which should respond. The signals from the foot are transmitted to the back of the top of the brain through the spinal cord and then down to the shoulder. And lastly, use a ruler or measuring tape to measure the length of the thread used in procedure 5.
Next, we proceed with the discussion. For the first experiment, experiment 6.1, which is swallowing reflex, we found out from this experiment that after we swallowed all of the saliva for the first time, it became hard for us to swallow again. But when we continued the experiment with the second step, we drank the water. So we can easily continue to swallow again as the water can act as replacement of the saliva. So here, we can conclude that actually swallowing is an automatic action which the body gives in response to something.
In 6.2 experiment reaction time to sight, we could see at the beginning of the experiment, the time lapse between the experimenter and subject recorded is quite high, which is 0.17 seconds until 0.30 seconds at the 5th trial. However, during the last 5 trial, the time lapse is reduced until 0.11 seconds at the NIN trial. This shows that the subject gets more sensitive to the stimulus she received and become cautious to stop the stopwatch.
So based on the experiment reaction time to touch, it can be observed that the time lapse between the experimenter and the subject. The results shows that the time lapse between the experimenter and the subject are not consistent due to a few factors. The experimenter pressed the stopwatch to stop and pressed the subject's foot at the same time. But the experimental response is slower due to the time taken for the information to transmit to the brain. Sensation begin as signals generated by touch receptor in the skin, which travel along sensory nerves made up of spinal fibers that connect to neurons in the spinal cord. Then signals move to the thalamus, which relay information to the rest of the brain.
Precautions and ethics. For experiment swallowing reflex, we must ensure the flow of the swallowing process is smooth without problems in rapid succession. For experiments reaction to sight, make sure that the experimenter and subject start the stopwatch at the same time. For experiment reaction time to touch, avoid stepping the subject's foot too hard. As for the conclusion, we can identify the spinal and the cerebral reflex by differentiate the movement of the action. Swallowing saliva is considered as spinal reflex, while reaction to time and touch are cerebral reflex. Based on the experiment, the average time to sight is 0.168 seconds, while the average of time to touch is 0.09 seconds. The speed at which the nerve system transmitted the impulses is 16.67 meter per second, and the length of the pathway between receptor and effector is 2.4 meter. The experiment shows how reflexes in our body works.